Dawn breaks cold and pale over the Polish frontier on September 1st, 1939. Mist hangs low across the fields near the Vistula, drifting around the steel tracks of German panzer columns waiting in silence. Engines idle, trembling with contained violence. Luftwaffe aircraft circle high above, silhouettes cutting through the morning haze. Polish border guards, exhausted from a night of scattered alerts, scan the horizon without knowing that in seconds their world will change forever. At 4:40 a.m., the battleship Schleswig-Holstein opens fire on the Westerplatte. Artillery thunder rolls across the coast. Radios flash with frantic messages. Orders echo across German formations. And then the tanks begin to move. Slowly, deliberately, as if history itself has decided to resume a story it left unfinished 2 decades earlier. Yet this moment, this single morning that ignites the deadliest conflict in human history, was not born from sudden fury or isolated decision. It was the final link in a chain of consequences stretching back to the smoke, grief, and broken promises of 1918. To understand why the world slid once more into catastrophe, we must return to the fragile years after the First World War, when the seeds of the next conflict were quietly taking root. The First World War ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, Europe stood on the edge of collapse. Entire empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, had crumbled under the strain of 4 years of industrial slaughter. Borders shifted like sand in a storm, new nations emerged uncertain and vulnerable, and millions of soldiers returned home to countries they no longer recognized. Germany, once one of Europe's great powers, was in chaos. The Kaiser had fled, political factions battled in the streets, and hunger gnawed at cities cut off by blockade. The country's new Weimar government entered the peace negotiations at Versailles not as an equal victor or even a defeated rival, but as a broken nation forced to sign terms it had little power to resist. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was intended to prevent another war. Instead, it planted the roots of the next. Germany was compelled to accept full blame for the conflict. The infamous Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This single sentence became a national wound. The treaty imposed harsh reparations, territorial losses, and strict military restrictions. The once mighty German army was reduced to 100,000 men, its navy stripped, its air force abolished. The Ruhr, the industrial heart of the nation, was vulnerable to occupation, and its economy, already fragile, began to crumble. To many Germans, Versailles did not look like peace. It looked like humiliation. Beyond Germany, the world struggled with its own crises. In Eastern Europe, newly created states, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, fought to establish identity and security amid ethnic tensions. The Russian Empire's collapse had unleashed the Bolshevik Revolution, sending shockwaves through Europe. Western governments feared communist expansion just as much as nationalist revenge. Meanwhile, in Italy, veterans returned home angry and embittered. They had won the war, but felt cheated by the peace settlements. This resentment helped fuel the rise of Benito Mussolini, who in 1922 marched on Rome and established Europe's first fascist dictatorship. To the east, Japan, victorious and expanding, took note of how Europe had weakened itself. Though an allied power in World War I, Japan emerged with ambitions that would soon strain its relations with the West. Its growing industrial base required resources, and its leaders saw opportunity in the instability of Asia. Economically, the early 1920s were volatile. Hyperinflation devastated Germany in 1923, wiping out savings and destroying trust in democratic leadership. Photographs from the time show workers carrying wages in baskets, prices doubling within hours, and families burning currency for warmth because it was cheaper than coal. Such desperation created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. But perhaps the most dangerous legacy of the First World War was psychological. The conflict had promised to be the war to end all wars, yet its aftermath felt unfinished. Veterans carried trauma home to societies that struggled to understand their experiences. Children grew up amid monuments to slaughter. Governments attempted to rebuild while managing deep internal divisions. Across Europe, people searched for answers, and too often they found them in radical movements promising strength, stability, and restored national pride. Democracy, fragile and unfamiliar in many countries, faced constant assault from both the far left and the far right. In this fragile environment, a new narrative began to form, one that blamed the old elites, foreign powers, or minority groups for national decline. These narratives would later be exploited by ambitious leaders who understood the power of grievance. By the mid-1920s, the world was no longer recovering from war. It was drifting into a new era defined by uncertainty, resentment, and competition. The peace settlement had ended the fighting, but it had not resolved the tensions that caused it. Instead, it reshaped them, pushing nations toward new ambitions and new fears. And as the decade progressed, the fragile balance built after 1918 faced an even greater test, one that would shake the global order to its core. The next chapter of the story begins not with armies or borders, but with a financial collapse that would reach into every home and every government, changing the course of the world. The fragile peace crafted in the 1920s collapsed abruptly when the global economy shattered. The Great Depression, triggered by the stock market crash of 1929, rippled across continents with destructive force. Factories closed, banks failed, and unemployment numbers surged into the tens of millions. Hungry citizens stood in endless lines, and governments struggled to keep order as despair spread through every layer of society. In Germany, where the scars of Versailles were still open wounds, the Depression hit with catastrophic intensity. The Weimar Republic, already mistrusted and burdened by years of instability, buckled under the weight of economic collapse. Political extremism surged. On the streets, communist and National Socialist paramilitaries clashed violently, each claiming to offer salvation from chaos. Millions of Germans, desperate for a leader who promised strength, turned to a man who offered simple answers to complex problems: Adolf Hitler. By January 1933, Hitler had become chancellor. Within months, he dismantled the democratic system, banned rival parties, and began reshaping Germany into a totalitarian state. Rearmament, strictly forbidden under Versailles, accelerated in secret and then openly. Military factories roared back to life, restoring national pride, but also preparing Germany for a path that would inevitably challenge the international order. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan faced its own crisis. The Depression devastated its export-based economy, empowering the military faction within the government. Officers asserted that Japan's survival required expansion into resource-rich territories. In 1931, they seized Manchuria, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but offered no meaningful resistance. Japan withdrew from the League and continued its aggressive course, convinced that Western powers would not stop them. Italy, too, pursued ambitions fueled by frustration and desire for imperial glory. Mussolini, eager to revive the grandeur of ancient Rome, invaded Ethiopia in 1935. The League of Nations again condemned, but failed to act decisively. Economic sanctions were weak and inconsistently applied. The lesson was clear: collective security existed in speeches, not in action. These failures had enormous consequences. They encouraged aggressive powers to believe that the international system was hollow and that they could rewrite borders by force. As dictators strengthened their grip, democracies faltered. France and Britain still carried the trauma of the First World War. Their populations feared another conflict and pressured their leaders to avoid confrontation. Economic hardship, political divisions, and pacifist movements further weakened their resolve. For policymakers in London and Paris, maintaining peace, even at the cost of concessions, seemed the only responsible path. This mindset shaped the strategy that later became known as appeasement. the belief that satisfying some of Germany's demands could prevent another war. When Hitler ordered troops into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936, Britain and France protested but did nothing. German generals expected fierce resistance and were prepared to retreat if France responded militarily. Instead, Hitler received a victory without firing a shot. His confidence grew. 2 years later, in March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, violating yet another key section of Versailles. Again, no major power intervened. In the autumn of 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a significant German-speaking population. At the Munich Conference, Britain and France agreed to the demand, believing they had secured peace for our time. But within 6 months, Hitler broke his promise and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The illusion of stability was gone. Europe was no longer drifting toward conflict. It was accelerating toward it. Yet the 1930s were not defined solely by dictators. They were shaped by a broader, global crisis of confidence. Democracies hesitated. International institutions failed. Economic systems buckled. Nations acted out of fear, pride, and miscalculation. It was a decade in which the world's safeguards fell apart one by one. And as tension deepened, each of these forces, economic ruin, political extremism, weakened diplomacy, unchecked militarism, began to converge around a single question. How long could the fragile peace survive? The answer would arrive in the form of decisions made by leaders who believed time was running out and who saw opportunity where others saw danger. The story now shifts to the deeper forces and perspectives that shape the road to war. Perspectives that reveal why the conflict became unavoidable. The origins of the Second World War cannot be understood without acknowledging the emotional landscape left behind by the First. Across Europe, an entire generation carried the weight of loss. Nearly every family had been touched by grief. Sons buried in Flanders, fathers missing in Galicia, brothers left in unmarked trenches from the Somme to Verdun. For millions, the war did not end in 1918. It lived in memory, shaping fears, hopes, and choices. This collective trauma shaped nations in different ways. In Germany, the memory of the war was tied closely to the humiliation of defeat and the hardships that followed. Veterans who returned home felt betrayed by political leaders they believed had surrendered too soon. Many refused to accept that the army had been beaten on the battlefield. The stab in the back myth took root, falsely claiming that Germany had been undermined by internal enemies. Though entirely unfounded, it became a powerful political weapon, one that extremists would later wield to devastating effect. In France, trauma took a different form. The nation had won the war, but victory fell hollow. The human cost had been enormous. More than a quarter of French men aged 18 to 30 had been killed. The landscape of northeastern France bore scars that would last for generations. As a result, French public opinion turned deeply inward. The country built massive defensive fortifications like the Maginot Line, determined never again to suffer the horrors of invasion. But this defensive mindset also created hesitation, caution, and a political instinct to avoid confrontation wherever possible. Britain experienced similar anxieties. The war had been a total national effort, leaving behind painful memories of attrition, rationing, and mass conscription. British society embraced pacifism in the 1920s and 1930s, believing that diplomacy and cooperation, not force, would secure the future. This mindset influenced leaders who hoped that accommodating rising dictators might prevent another tragedy. Meanwhile, in Japan, Italy, and parts of Eastern Europe, the post-war sense of disappointment, resentment, and national grievance fueled a desire for renewed strength and global recognition. These emotions helped empower leaders who promised rebirth through military expansion. Across the world, people carried the memory of sacrifice and a fear of repeating it. This emotional legacy would become one of the deepest undercurrents pulling nations toward the next conflict. 2. The political angle, democracies in retreat, extremism on the rise. The political environment of the interwar years was unstable and turbulent. Democratic institutions, new in many parts of Europe, struggled to survive economic crisis, social unrest, and political violence. As governments faltered, extremist parties surged. In Germany, the Weimar Republic became a symbol of dysfunction. With frequent elections, fragile coalitions, and violent street clashes, many Germans grew frustrated with democratic processes that seemed unable to deliver stability. The Nazi Party exploited this frustration masterfully. Promising order, national dignity, and economic recovery, it presented itself as the antidote to chaos. By the time Hitler seized full power in 1933, he had dismantled every democratic safeguard. From that moment on, German politics was no longer a struggle of parties. It was the absolute rule of one man. Italy had already set a precedent. Mussolini's rise in 1922 demonstrated how quickly democracy could be swept aside by charismatic authoritarian movements. His regime glorified militarism, expansionism, and obedience, setting a model for fascist parties across Europe. Even long-established democracies were strained. France grappled with political fragmentation and economic instability, resulting in frequent changes of government. Britain, while politically stable, struggled to reconcile pacifist public opinion with the growing threat abroad. Parliamentary debates often focused on avoiding war rather than preventing aggression. Eastern Europe was even more volatile. Poland, Hungary, Romania, and several Baltic states adopted authoritarian systems, driven by fears of communism or internal divisions. With few strong democratic institutions remaining, Europe became a landscape dominated by dictatorships, each pursuing national interests without regard for collective security. By the late 1930s, the international political order was hollow. Treaties were ignored, diplomacy was distrusted, and the League of Nations, the institution meant to preserve peace, proved powerless. Its inability to stop Japanese aggression in Manchuria, Italian expansion in Africa, and German rearmament signaled to the world that agreements had lost meaning. As authoritarian leaders gained influence, they reshaped the political climate into one defined by ambition, resentment, and confrontation, conditions that made war increasingly likely. 3. The economic angle, scarcity, competition, and the search for recovery. The economic dimensions of the interwar years were central to the rise of tensions. The Great Depression was not merely a financial crisis. It was a global collapse that transformed economies and destabilized governments. For Germany, the Depression was a national catastrophe. Unemployment soared to more than 6 million. Factories sat idle, and poverty became widespread. Under these conditions, extremist parties thrived. Hitler's promise of jobs, economic revival, and national renewal resonated deeply. Rearmament became both a political instrument and an economic policy, stimulating industry and reducing unemployment. But it also set Germany on a collision course with the rest of Europe as economic revival became inseparable from military expansion. Japan faced a similar crisis. Lacking natural resources, it depended heavily on imported raw materials. When global trade collapsed, Japanese leaders concluded that economic self-sufficiency, autarky, was essential. This led directly to the invasion of Manchuria, a region rich in coal, iron, and agricultural land. Economic necessity evolved into military expansionism. Italy also sought economic solutions through imperial conquest. Mussolini believed that colonies would provide the raw materials and markets needed to revive Italy's economy. The invasion of Ethiopia was driven not only by ideology, but by a belief that conflict would spark economic renewal. Even Britain and France were affected. Economic hardship restricted their ability to rearm or project power abroad. Governments struggled to match public demands for domestic relief with the strategic need to confront rising dictatorships. As a result, they delayed military investment at precisely the moment when authoritarian powers were accelerating theirs. By the mid-1930s, global economic pressures had pushed nations into aggressive competition for resources, markets, and influence. Economic instability drove political extremism, weakened democracies, and encouraged imperial ambition. And these human, political, and economic forces were only part of the story. Other forces, military doctrines, ideological visions, and diplomatic failures, were aligning in ways that would make war not just possible, but almost certain. The interwar years reshaped military thinking across the world. Nations studied the devastation of the First World War and sought new doctrines that could prevent another stalemate. But instead of promoting stability, these doctrines fueled competition and mistrust. Germany, restricted by Versailles, became a laboratory of innovation. With its army limited to 100,000 men, the Reichswehr focused on mobility, combined arms, and rapid offensive operations. Secret cooperation with the Soviet Union during the 1920s allowed German officers to test aircraft, tanks, and chemical weapons away from Allied scrutiny. By the time Hitler took power in 1933, a blueprint for a future mechanized force already existed. Under his leadership, rearmament accelerated dramatically. The Luftwaffe was created in defiance of Versailles. New divisions of panzer tanks formed, and military factories operated at unprecedented speed. Elsewhere, Japan modernized its navy and expanded its army, preparing for conflict in China and the Pacific. Italy, despite technological limitations, embraced air power and armored divisions as symbols of national strength. Even France and Britain, though slower to act, eventually recognized the growing threat and began rearming in the late 1930s. Military strategy itself shifted. The static trenches of 1914 to 1918 had taught generals that speed, coordination, and mechanization would shape the next war. Germany believed that swift, decisive offensives, later known as Blitzkrieg, could overwhelm enemies before they could mobilize. Japan adopted a doctrine based on rapid territorial expansion to secure resources. Italy envisioned quick colonial wars to restore Roman grandeur. These strategic visions did not just prepare nations for war. They made war increasingly likely. Each rearmament program eroded trust. Each new division or air squadron signaled ambition. By the late 1930s, the world was not only politically polarized, but militarily primed for conflict. The balance of power was shifting, and every nation knew it. 5. The ideological angle. Fascism, nationalism, and racial expansionism. While economics and strategy shaped the environment, ideologies shaped intentions. The 1930s were defined by competing visions of how the world should be organized, each incompatible with the others. Nazi ideology was built on notions of racial hierarchy, territorial expansion, and the belief that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe. This was not a metaphor. It was a concrete strategic objective. Hitler viewed Slavic nations as obstacles to German destiny and saw war as both necessary and inevitable. The Nazi worldview rejected negotiation, compromise, and equality among nations. In its logic, peace was merely a temporary pause before expansion. Italian fascism, though less racially extreme, also pursued imperial revival. Mussolini believed Italy had been denied its rightful place among great powers. He sought to expand into Africa and the Balkans, arguing that conquest was essential for national unity and strength. Japanese militarism blended nationalism with the concept of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. Leaders claimed they aimed to liberate Asia from Western colonialism, but in practice, the policy justified expansion into China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Militarists viewed war not as a failure of diplomacy, but as an expression of national destiny. Against these ideologies stood Western liberal democracies, promoting diplomacy, individual rights, and collective security. But these values seemed weak in a world ruled increasingly by force. The ideological divide deepened as Germany, Italy, and Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, rejected international norms, and embraced isolation. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union pursued its own revolutionary ideology. Though Stalin prioritized internal control during the 1930s, the USSR remained suspicious of both fascist and capitalist states, contributing to a diplomatic environment of distrust. The ideological hostility between Stalin and Western powers undermined potential cooperation against Germany at critical moments. By the end of the decade, ideological extremism had transformed international relations into a confrontation between incompatible worldviews. War was no longer simply a struggle for territory. It was a struggle over the future shape of civilization itself. 6. The diplomatic angle. Miscalculations, weak institutions, and the failure of peace diplomacy in the interwar years was defined by hope, but shaped by misjudgment. The League of Nations, created to prevent another global conflict, lacked the authority and unity needed to enforce peace. Member states were reluctant to apply sanctions or military pressure, fearing escalation or domestic backlash. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the act but offered no decisive response. Japan interpreted this as a sign of weakness. Italy observed the same pattern during its invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, concluding that the international community lacked resolve. For Germany, each diplomatic failure reinforced a belief that Britain and France would avoid confrontation at almost any cost. This perception shaped Hitler's decisions throughout the 1930s. When he reoccupied the Rhineland, he gambled that France would not act, and he was right. When he annexed Austria, he assumed the Allies would protest but not intervene, and he was right again. The Munich Agreement, which handed over the Sudetenland in exchange for promises of peace, only confirmed his worldview. But diplomatic failure was not simply appeasement. It was also fragmentation. Britain and France disagreed on strategy. The United States retreated into isolationism after World War I. The Soviet Union was viewed with suspicion by Western democracies, and small nations caught between great powers faced impossible choices. As a result, diplomacy during the 1930s became reactive rather than preventive. Agreements were made to buy time rather than address underlying tensions. Warnings were issued without enforcement. Alliances shifted too slowly to deter aggression. By 1939, diplomacy had all but collapsed. Every major nation expected conflict. Every leader prepared for a future shaped by force, not negotiation. All these angles, military buildup, ideological extremism, and diplomatic failure, converged to make war increasingly inevitable. And in the final years before the conflict erupted, a series of pivotal events pushed the world past the point of return. The late 1930s marked a moment when history accelerated toward conflict. Each decision, each violation of international norms, nudged Europe closer to war. By 1938, the illusions of appeasement and diplomacy were already shattering. In March 1938, German troops crossed into Austria, executing the Anschluss. Hitler had promised his generals that this would be bloodless, and it was, at least in military terms. Austrian leaders surrendered almost without resistance, and cheering crowds greeted the German forces in Vienna. Yet the annexation violated both the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. European powers protested verbally, but no force was applied. Hitler, emboldened, recognized that the world would not stop him if he acted decisively. 6 months later, the Sudeten crisis brought Europe even closer to the edge. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a Czechoslovak region with a large ethnic German population. Unlike Austria, the Sudetenland was fortified, industrially significant, and critical to Czechoslovakia's survival. Nevertheless, Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French leaders sought to avoid war at all costs. They convened the Munich Conference in September 1938, allowing Hitler to annex the Sudetenland without consulting Czechoslovakia. Chamberlain returned home, declaring he had secured peace for our time, a statement that now reads as a tragic misjudgment. Behind the scenes, German generals and diplomats were preparing for more. Hitler's demands did not stop at ethnic German regions. Within months, he occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that appeasement had only encouraged ambition. European leaders were now forced to confront a harsh reality. Germany's expansionist agenda was limitless, and diplomatic concessions only delayed the inevitable confrontation. At the same time, Axis ambitions were growing elsewhere. In Asia, Japan continued its expansion into China, pursuing both economic resources and strategic territory. Military leaders justified their campaigns as necessary for survival, but in practice, their aggression destabilized an already fragile region. Italy, observing Germany's successes, intensified its presence in North Africa and the Balkans, while consolidating its alliance with Berlin. The chain reaction was not confined to land alone. Rearmament accelerated across Germany, Italy, and Japan, while Britain and France lagged. Tanks rolled off assembly lines, aircraft squadrons trained for offensive operations, and fleets were modernized. Every decision to prepare for war created an expectation that war might come, reinforcing a cycle of fear and aggression. Diplomacy, meanwhile, remained fragile and often misguided. The League of Nations, once hailed as a guarantor of peace, had lost credibility. Collective security had failed repeatedly, and no institution remained capable of enforcing agreements. Each nation now acted primarily to secure its own interests, often at the expense of stability. By early 1939, the world was a tinderbox. Hitler had eliminated Czechoslovakia, solidified alliances with Italy, and observed the restraint of Britain and France. In Asia, Japanese expansion threatened regional balance. In Eastern Europe, Poland became the focal point of strategic concern. Hitler's eyes were set eastward, and he began making plans for invasion, confident that opposition would be limited and divided. The decisive turning point, however, had yet to arrive. The next months would transform tension into inevitability. As alliances shifted, pacts were signed, and the final path toward global war was chosen. The world had already passed the point of no return. Europe's political, economic, and military systems were strained to their limits. Each act of aggression, each diplomatic misstep, created momentum. By the spring of 1939, the stage was set for the outbreak of the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. By March 1939, Hitler had demonstrated that diplomacy could not constrain his ambitions. The occupation of Czechoslovakia marked a clear violation of international agreements. Unlike the Sudetenland annexation, this move showed that Hitler's goals extended beyond ethnic unification. He now sought territory, resources, and strategic dominance, objectives that could no longer be placated through negotiation. In response, Britain and France began to rethink their policy of appeasement. Public opinion, shocked by Germany's brazen moves, pressed leaders to act. In March 1939, Britain guaranteed Poland's borders, promising military support if Germany attacked. France quickly followed suit, creating a formal alliance intended to deter aggression. Yet these promises were untested, and Germany recognized the limits of their commitment. Simultaneously, Hitler pursued diplomacy of his own, calculating that a pact with the Soviet Union would remove the Eastern threat and prevent a two-front war. Secret negotiations culminated in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed on August 23, 1939. The agreement included a non-aggression clause and a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, caught between the two powers, became a target with almost no chance of survival. Germany's military preparations accelerated. The Wehrmacht conducted large-scale exercises, testing new tactics of blitzkrieg, rapid armor movements, coordinated airstrikes, and synchronized infantry advances. Poland, though armed and mobilized, was strategically isolated. Its allies, Britain and France, were unprepared to act quickly or decisively. On September 1, 1939, the moment came. German forces crossed the Polish border, launching attacks along multiple fronts. Luftwaffe bombers rained destruction on cities, while panzer divisions pushed deep into the countryside. The invasion was swift, brutal, and efficient. Polish defenders fought courageously, but were overwhelmed by the combined power of modern German mechanized warfare. Within days, Europe's fragile balance collapsed. Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, honoring their commitments to Poland. Yet the declarations did little to immediately halt the German advance. The world had entered a new era of total war, one born not of a single misstep, but of nearly 2 decades of unresolved grievances, miscalculations, and unchecked ambition. Simultaneously, Japan moved further into China, consolidating its hold on Manchuria and pushing into central regions, while Italy positioned itself to support Germany strategically. These actions ensured that the conflict would not remain confined to Europe. It was set to become global. By the end of September, the first domino had fallen. Poland was divided, its sovereignty shattered. Germany and the Soviet Union solidified control over occupied territories. The stage was set for World War II, a conflict whose causes stretched far beyond the immediate battles, reaching back to the unresolved tensions of 1918, the failures of the 1920s, and the crises of the 1930s. The decisive turning point had arrived. The choices of leaders, the pressures of ideology, the failures of diplomacy, and the momentum of history had combined to create a world in which war was inevitable. Every subsequent battle, occupation, and campaign would flow from the decisions made in these critical months. As Europe braced for the months ahead, the consequences of inaction, miscalculation, and unchecked ambition were already visible. Thousands dead, cities burning, and a continent once again consumed by the machinery of total war. The aftermath of these decisions would not only reshape Europe, but alter the global balance of power for decades to come, leaving lessons that humanity would struggle to fully understand. The invasion of Poland set off a chain reaction that would engulf Europe and the wider world. Within hours of the German attack on September 1, 1939, Polish radio stations broadcast urgent messages to the nation, calling citizens to arms. Cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Danzig braced for bombardment. Civilians fled streets as Luftwaffe bombers struck military targets, railroads, and communication hubs. Panzer divisions advanced with terrifying efficiency, cutting off retreat routes and encircling defensive positions. Despite desperate resistance, the Polish military was outmatched by Germany's mechanized and coordinated approach. Britain and France, honoring their guarantees to Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3. Yet the reality on the ground was stark. The Allies were unprepared for immediate offensive action. French and British armies mobilized slowly, constrained by both logistics and public opinion, and engaged only in limited skirmishes along the French-German border during what became known as the Phony War. For months, Europe waited, tense and uncertain, while Poland endured the brunt of the German assault alone. The Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland on September 17, 1939, sealing the country's fate. Cities and towns fell under occupation, military units surrendered en masse, and civilians faced repression, deportation, or execution. The country was divided along the lines of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, leaving no effective resistance against the combined forces. By the end of September, Poland ceased to exist as an independent state, a stark warning of the ruthlessness and efficiency of Axis powers. Meanwhile, the rapid German victories created shockwaves across Europe. Neutral nations watched with fear as borders vanished overnight. Governments accelerated mobilization, stockpiled resources, and revised military plans. The speed and scale of the German attack shattered assumptions about the effectiveness of traditional defensive strategies, exposing the inadequacy of fortifications like the Maginot Line in countering mechanized warfare. In Asia, Japanese forces continued their campaigns in China, consolidating control over Manchuria and advancing into northern regions. While Europe's attention focused on Germany, Japan quietly expanded its influence, demonstrating that the world was entering a conflict with global dimensions. Italy, observing Germany's success, prepared to align more openly with the Axis, strengthening the strategic position of aggressive powers. The human cost was immediate and stark. Thousands of Polish soldiers were killed in the first weeks of combat. Civilians became targets of aerial bombing and artillery barges. Refugees streamed toward borders, seeking safety in neighboring countries. Fear, chaos, and uncertainty became the daily reality for millions. Politically, the invasion marked the end of appeasement. Britain and France had honored their promises, but the failure to prevent war underscored the limits of diplomacy. The swift collapse of Poland demonstrated that aggressive powers were willing and capable of ignoring international norms with near impunity. The world had entered a new phase of conflict, one defined not by localized battles, but by large-scale mobilization, strategic coordination, and total war. Germany's success in Poland would embolden its leaders, reshape military doctrines, and set a precedent for the campaigns that would soon follow across Europe. The immediate consequences of the invasion highlighted the fragility of peace, the dangers of underestimating authoritarian ambition, and the brutal reality of modern warfare. These months would define the tone of the early war period, shaping strategies, alliances, and human experiences for the years ahead. The fall of Poland was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Germany's military momentum continued unchecked. By April 1940, Denmark and Norway fell in a lightning campaign, demonstrating the efficiency of coordinated land, air, and sea operations. In May, Blitzkrieg swept through the Low Countries in France. Paris fell by June 1940, leaving Britain isolated and facing the threat of invasion. The rapid collapse of Western Europe stunned the world, showing that the traditional balance of power had been decisively overturned. Axis successes did more than redraw borders. They transformed global politics and military strategy. Germany's early victories emboldened Hitler to pursue larger objectives, while Japan expanded aggressively throughout Asia and the Pacific. Italy, initially less competent, sought to claim spoils in North Africa and the Balkans. Each campaign reinforced a pattern. Bold, aggressive action brought tangible rewards, and the world's response remained fragmented and reactive. The human toll escalated exponentially. Millions of soldiers and civilians were caught in occupations, bombings, and forced displacements. In Poland alone, hundreds of thousands of Jews, intellectuals, and political figures were subjected to persecution or execution, foreshadowing the genocidal policies that would expand across Europe. Refugee crises swelled, straining neighboring countries and further destabilizing the continent. Strategically, the war accelerated technological and doctrinal innovation. Germany's use of mechanized units and air power forced allies to rethink conventional approaches. Radar, code-breaking, and combined arms operations became central to military planning. The conflict also highlighted the logistical challenges of global warfare, pushing nations to mobilize industry, manpower, and resources on unprecedented scales. Politically, the war reshaped alliances and international institutions. The United States, initially neutral, would eventually enter the conflict after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, creating a truly global theater of war. The Soviet Union, despite its early pact with Germany, became a decisive force after Operation Barbarossa in 1941. The balance of power shifted continually, with the outcome uncertain until the final years of the conflict. The aftermath also left a permanent imprint on society. Entire cities were destroyed, economies devastated, and populations traumatized. Post-war reconstruction required international coordination on a scale previously unimaginable, leading to institutions such as the United Nations, designed to prevent future global catastrophes. Yet the lessons of miscalculation, appeasement, and unchecked aggression remain central to understanding modern geopolitics. Ultimately, the consequences of the events of 1938 to 1939 extended far beyond immediate military outcomes. They shaped the trajectory of the entire 20th century. The rise and fall of empires, the spread of ideologies, and the restructuring of the international order. Nations learned that peace, once fragile, must be actively maintained, and that historical grievances economic hardship, and political extremism can converge to ignite conflicts of unprecedented scale. By 1945, the world had been irrevocably changed. The borders of Europe were redrawn, the geopolitical landscape shifted, and the collective memory of global suffering would define international relations for decades. The immediate chain of events that began in Poland had set in motion a war whose consequences extended into every continent, every society, and every future generation. The long-term consequences were clear. Wars are rarely sudden. They are the culmination of decades of tension, error, ambition, and unresolved grievances. Understanding the path from 1918 to 1939 is essential to understanding why the Second World War was not merely a historical accident, but the inevitable result of human decisions and systemic failures. The world had paid a staggering price for hesitation, miscalculation, and the allure of easy solutions. Looking back, the origins of the Second World War reveal a sobering truth. Wars do not emerge from a single spark, but from a long accumulation of unresolved grievances, failed diplomacy, and human ambition. The events of 1918 to 1939 were a cascade of decisions and miscalculations, each amplifying the next, shaping a world in which conflict became almost inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure peace, instead left humiliation, resentment, and economic instability in its wake. The trauma of the First World War shaped generations, fueling political extremism and ideological fervor. Democratic institutions faltered under pressure, while authoritarian leaders exploited fear, ambition, and nationalism to consolidate power. Economic collapse, especially during the Great Depression, intensified desperation, pushing societies toward radical solutions and militarized expansion. Ideology, whether fascist, nationalist, or militarist, framed conquest as a moral duty or historical inevitability. Diplomacy, weakened by appeasement and miscalculation, proved powerless to restrain ambition. Military innovation created new opportunities for rapid, devastating action, rendering traditional defenses obsolete. And in the end, these human, political, economic, ideological, and military forces converged in a perfect storm. The lesson is clear. Peace is fragile, and its preservation requires constant vigilance, humility, and foresight. The Second World War did not begin in a single moment. It was the result of decades of choices, compromises, and oversights. Each act of aggression, each unheeded warning, each missed opportunity to address injustice contributed to the catastrophe that followed. Yet amid the destruction, history also offers perspective. By examining the chain of events from 1918 to 1939, we gain insight into the mechanisms that produce conflict and the responsibilities of leaders and societies to prevent it. Understanding the past allows us to recognize warning signs, to value diplomacy and restraint, and to remember the human cost of failure. The war that erupted in September 1939 was not an accident. It was the culmination of a generation's fears, ambitions, and errors. And it remains a profound reminder. The path to peace is never automatic. It is a constant, deliberate endeavor, demanding courage, wisdom, and the humility to learn from history.